welcome you to Mahindra seminar on universities. My name is Manja Klemencic. I am a lecturer in sociology of higher education at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Harvard University. I co-chair this seminar series together with Professors Julie Ruben and Professor Luc Menant. And today I will be moderating this seminar. Today's seminar is also endorsed by the Weatherhead Center's research cluster on comparative inequality and inclusion at Harvard University. So there is a broader interest at Harvard in this specific topic. The topic of today's seminar is student impact on higher education. And this topic tries to correct the so far one-directional study and scholarship in higher education studies, which was primarily interested in how higher education, the colleges and universities, affect students, their student learning, student employability, social mobility, and the such. But the guiding question for this seminar is how students influence and can influence higher education. And to answer this question, today we will primarily focus on student representation, although we recognize that there are other mechanisms through which students can influence higher education. Activism, consumerism, students' voluntary and paid service in universities, all of those are also mechanisms for student influence on higher education. With us today, we have a panel of a highly distinguished student leaders who have devoted a considerable part of their lives to representing student interest and for fighting for student rights. They rose individually from through the ranks of student representation at their institutions into the national level, and then from there into the regional student platforms, and now joined together as well in the Global Student Forum, which is the global platform representing student interest. Before I introduce them in detail, allow me a very brief introduction to the team of student unions or student governments and student representation. This is mostly for those who are not student leaders, although from the chat I can see many of you that are attending this event are from the ranks of the student governments and student representatives. But let's do the introduction. So these representative student associations tend to go by different names: student unions, student councils, student governments, student parliaments. They are a distinct form of political institutions within higher education. They organize, aggregate, and intermediate student interest in higher education, and they defend student rights. They also provide services to students and organize student activities. Maybe just a little footnote for the local attendees from Harvard and from our usual Mahindra seminar attendees. So at Harvard, it would be the Harvard's Undergraduate Student Council and the Graduate Student Council that are the types of organization like we will be talking here today. The Harvard Graduate Student Union, United Auto Workers Trade Union, is a different type. It is a trade union that represents the interests of student workers and engages in collective bargaining on their behalf. The student governments we speak about here are often in close relationship with trade unions, but they are the different type of student organizations that represent students. Okay, it's just a little footnote so that we know who is who. So student governments or student unions that we are talking here today about are typically autonomous, entirely student-run, and democratically governed, and representatives are typically democratically elected by the student body. They have at their disposal a very varying degree of organizational resources and funding, from some student unions at universities having a multi-million-dollar budgets, and at others having very little or no financial resources at all. So there's a lot of differences between the student unions globally. So student unions operate at all levels of higher education governance, starting at the departmental level, even course level, moving on to the institutional, national, transnational, and now we can see also global level. So often what we see in the countries is that institutional student unions from different higher education institutions associate into the national union. And what we can also see is that the national student unions associate and form a regional federation like the ones that we have represented today. But this is not the case in every country, and it's not the case in every world region. And you will be hearing about some of the differences in this regard from our panelists as well. Finally, when we discuss or study student unions, we usually look at two issues. One issue is how they are organized. Here we're interested in membership, organizational resources and funding, governance structures, political agendas and activities. And all of these are directly relevant, one, to the organizational capacities that the student unions have to do the student union work, but also to the autonomy that these questions the student unions have as freedom from interference from others, and thus also political legitimacy. And the other issue that we look at when we look at the student union is their representation, right? Their mechanisms to represent students. Do student representatives have voting rights in university governing bodies, or they are consulted as needed and as decided by the university administrators? Do student representatives have a seat in the National Higher Education Council or other national level political body deciding on higher education, or they get audience with the minister after they protest to be heard? So this is some of the questions. And what we are interested here is about the channels of lobby and advocacy that are at disposal to the student union representatives, whether these are formal and institutionalized or informal and occasional, whether these, the relationship between the student unions and the authorities are constructive, cooperative, or they're conflictual. And what we also, and all of that brings us back to the questions of autonomy of student unions and student representatives, their legitimacy, but also issues and questions of tokenistic involvement of students in the political processes within higher education, and possible domestication of student representatives. What I mean here, where student representatives grow too close to those that are there trying to influence and distance themselves from the student body that they're supposed to represent. So this was a brief introduction from me, and hereby ended the lesson from the professor, and the attention goes to our distinguished panelists. I am mostly grateful to the panelists for their time and commitment to come today to us, and I'm eager to present to you the 5 panelists that we have here today. They have distinguished biographies, and we have posted those on our website. So my introduction, in the interest of time, will be very brief, and in the alphabetical order, I present to you Sebastian Berger, who is the Executive Director of the Global Students Forum, the GSF. Martina Darmanin, President of the European Students' Union, ESU. There is Martina. Peter Koji, Secretary General of the All Africa Students' Union, the ASU. Musarat Maisha Reza, Chairperson of the Commonwealth Students Association, CSA. And Bianca Borges dos Santos, member of the Executive Secretariat of the Organización Continental Latinoamericana y Caribeña de Estudiantes, OCLAE. Dear panelists, welcome for being here today with us. A quick note for the attendees. You have already checked out the chat function. The chat function is for us for the introduction and the comments. We have a Q&A function. Please feel free to pose the questions through the Q&A at any time. This seminar is divided into kind of 3 little segments, 3 rounds of questions, and there will be time for the answering to your questions attendees after each of these rounds. This seminar is recorded just for your information, and without any further ado, I am ready to begin. We will start with a very open question, and that is, how are your student federations organized? If you can tell us a little bit about the membership of your organization. So this is a very kind of a introductory questions into your student organizations. And I would suggest that we start with Peter and learn about ASU. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maya, and it's a good evening from Accra, Ghana, and I'm excited that I have an opportunity to join the discussions today. And Maya, let me say thank you for organizing this. Sebastian, thank you to you about times. I'm going to give a bit of a background about the All Africa Students Union, and the All Africa Students Union is the umbrella organization for all students in Africa, both on the continent and in the diaspora. And we do represent 71 member unions, and with a combined population around 170 million. We were formed in 1972, and in the time that we were formed, our outlook suggested that we were a lot more confrontational. In that sense, we had to fight colonialism, we had to fight the apartheid regimes in South Africa. That warranted us to have a much confrontational outlook. In the times that has passed, we've had to reinvent ourselves. And so much of the work has have drifted more towards a dialogue, it's drifted more towards negotiations in that sense. And majority of the work that we do is condensed into 7 strategic priorities. So we work in education and student rights. We work with in migration and mobility. We do a lot of work in environment and climate action. We also do some work in democracy and good governance. We work in capacity building, gender advocacy, and Pan-Africanism and African culture. In terms of what our structure looks like, we're autonomous, we're democratically elected, which is very fundamental to us. And so for any member union to qualify to join us, you would have to be democratically elected. And that's one thing that is non-negotiable. We're wholly student-led, we're wholly student-run, and we're autonomous in the sense that even if we receive funding and etc. from organizations, they don't direct us as to what we should do. And so the extent to which you fund is just limited to seeing it as a responsibility. But from the point that the money comes in, we direct it according to the objectives of the organization. And so we also look at it by way of our context as Africa. Majority of the challenges that we've had to deal with has to do with a lot of political interference. We have to deal with authoritarian regimes. As we speak, majority of our students are either brutalized, they have been arrested for the fact that they've had to stand against authoritarian regimes and interference in academic freedoms. And the other thing that we also have to deal with at our levels has to do with the high turnover. And so, for example, my tenure, for example, is 4-year mandate, but I've had to deal with 4 successions of students and leaders. And that implies that because of the changes, transitions become difficult. Seeing as I have just 4 minutes to do this, I think that for the first round, I may want to end here. And when there's an opportunity, I'll speak a lot about the work that we do. Thank you, Maya.
Peter, thank you for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for reminding us that the context sometimes requires from the student unions, right, to be either more confrontational, turn more activist when circumstances are such, and in other times more cooperative. And students are an important political force in the driving social change as well. And in African context especially, we have a very important history to testify of this. So thank you so much for this. Shall we move to Maisha to learn from the Commonwealth Student Association, please?
Of course, thank you, Manya. Can you hear me? Awesome. So the Commonwealth Students Association, we were created basically to advance student voice in policy and decision making in the Commonwealth education sector. And a steering committee was established at the Commonwealth Education Ministers meeting in 2012 in Mauritius. And then the first executive committee was elected in 2015 in Bahamas. So I think it's really important to understand our population demographics. We are, the young people make up more than half of the Commonwealth's population, so most of them being students. So we then realized that CSA is actually a very big platform for student voice to be consolidated in one space on a global level. So CSA is an independent organization. We are separate from the Commonwealth. We function autonomously. We make independent decisions. We have partnership agreements that are also independent, but we are still largely funded by the Commonwealth Youth Program. So we have been building capacities of student unions and student leaders and empowering them to address issues within fields of education in their own countries. And we're also an advocacy body. So we represent students on platforms that are on national, regional, and international level. Our membership is broken down into two parts: the full members and the associate members. So full members are national student unions or national student organizations. Like Peter said, they must be governed by students. They have to have a democratically elected leadership. Our associate members are those that exist when there are no national student organizations, but there are university-led student unions that must engage still with us under the same conditions. So we're not just in one region. We represent 4 different regions: the Asia, Pacific, Africa, and Europe together, and Caribbean and Americas. So just very quickly, I want to share some of the information that we got when we did the student governance report in 2016. We did that with 76 organizations across the Commonwealth. And just some in a little bit more detail, like 19 responses we got from Africa, 12 from Asia, 35 from Caribbean, 8 from Pacific, 2 from Europe, right? And over 80% of these organizations indicated that they had some national scope within their country, which means that whether or not they're, they consider themselves as a national student organization or they're registered as such, they can be considered, by definition, a national student organization. The most popular legal form of NSOs in the Commonwealth is NGO, which is your non-governmental organizations. A very small proportion of them are part of university departments. So 85% of our student unions have governing documents which help to set out decision-making processes in forms of constitution, of course. Their top 3 objectives are to advocate on behalf of individual students, develop policy in the interest of students, and offering advice and guidance. So I'll go into quickly funding and challenges. Funding mostly comes from, financial support comes from membership fees and some sponsorship from public-private entities. Very small percentage of our student unions, just 20%, actually receive government fundings on an annual basis. So 3 common challenges before I end off this section. 1, lack of resources, which is definitely a huge challenge. These student unions, though they get their membership fees as a model of financial stability, they identified it as not the most suitable long-term model. They don't find it the most effective. But there's also a big reliance on voluntary effort. Second obstacle, the reluctance from governments to see NSOs as partners and engage with students in the decision-making process. Some are even not consulted on relevant matters, and they have to raise it after decisions are made. And finally, I think a lot of our student unions also struggle with capacity building. So I'll end here.
Marsha, thank you so much. And thank you so much to remind us of the limitations in the organizational capabilities of the student unions and the massive volunteer work that student leaders are putting into the student unions to represent student interest, often juggling between finding other paid jobs to support themselves and still finding the times to support students and to do and follow their mission. Thank you so much. Let's continue with Martina and hear from Europe, please, from ESU.
Thank you so much, Manya, for the floor and for the question. Yes, so the European Students' Union has been established since 1982, so we're approaching now our 40-year anniversary next year, so we've been quite long-standing. And our membership has expanded, so currently we're holding a membership of 45 national unions of students from 40 different countries. So that expands beyond just European Union countries, but we also have countries that are part of the European higher education area, but also, for example, we have Israel that's also a member of ESO. And as you mentioned, yes, our criteria are that basically there are democratic representative and independent structures for representation, and that they are open to all students regardless of their political convictions, religion, ethnic, cultural origin, sexual orientation, or social standing. So it's also part of our statutes and our membership criteria, that they are also run by democratic elections. And basically through our membership, we aim to represent the views and interests of almost around 20 million students in Europe. And that's a quite high number of diverse, diverse socio-demographic characteristics of students. So how we try as much as possible to reach common approaches is, of course, we have 2 board meetings per year. And those are the highest decision-making bodies of the organization. They mandate the executive committees, they elect the candidates, but they also decide on our policies. Our policies, could it be on access to higher education, on internationalization, the quality of learning, of teaching, on the governance, they determine our representation, our advocacy towards the Council of Europe, towards the EU, towards the BFUG. And it also then influences what projects we take on or coordinate or partner in. And I mirror what many of my colleagues have said before me. In Europe, you can have the situation where you have either one general student, national student union, such as in Austria or Poland, but then you can have in a country multiple national student unions. In Finland, for example, they have one national student union representing applied science universities and one representing academic university student organizations. I won't go into much detail, but also just mentioning as well that as challenges, we might have the fact that there is national legislation in place to protect, that recognizes student participation nationally or in institutions, but then integrally then how that comes in from paper to practice can differ. Whether the students can elect their own representatives is not always the case. As we currently see in the new European Universities Initiative. Unfortunately, we also have the ability to influence decision-making if they just hold a consultative role, or if they're in such a minority that it does not make so much of a difference. As well as was mentioned earlier, as the commodification of higher education, where you have students taking up multiple jobs, that tends to deprioritize the ability to volunteer in student organizations.
All right, Martina, thank you as well. Let's hear from Bianca and get a sense of how student unionism is organized in Latin America, from OCLAE and down to the national level. Bianca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manja. So OCLAE was created 55 years ago in Cuba, which is our host country. We have an anti-capitalist, an anti-imperialist charter, and great inspiration from the 20th century students' initiatives, such as the American University Students' Congress, and especially the Cordoba University reform, which culminated in the 198 strike. Since its creation, OCLAE has functioned as a mobilizing and coordinating body for the anti-imperialist struggles of the student movement on the continent. Among our historical flags and actions are the struggle of students for solidarity and against neoliberalism, imperialism, neocolonialism, and social injustice, the university's autonomy, academic freedom and plurality, the principle of free public education for all, the struggle to eradicate illiteracy and students' welfare, and also the strengthening of the student movement ties with the working class, peasants, indigenous people, and with the popular and democratic sector of civil society. In recent years, we have intensified our fight against the commodification of education and the resistance to the offensive of large educational institutions, mainly of the United States, to include education in the negotiations on service of the World Trade Organization and to regulate the distance education system, which would aim at standardizing curricular content and expanding the hegemony of English over other languages as a way to disseminate the North American ideology through our region. OCLAI has also sought student interaction through sports and international events, such as the World Youth and Students Festival, the Hemispheric Forum, and the World Social Forum, aligning itself with social movements in campaigns against war and neoliberalism. These days, OCLAI represents 36 student federations from 23 countries, with more than 10 million students as affiliated. The member organizations are mainly directed by political party youths and are very focused on being connected to the student bases and day-to-day life. So I would say that we are much more, in general, connected to the streets than to the governments. And since the new millennium, the organization has been characterized also by the fight in favor of free and quality education in Latin America and Caribbean.
What I hear, Bianca, from you is that there's lots of topics, political agendas that permeate the student federations represented here, but then there are also a specific context-specific, right, agenda, which are very much present in a specific region, and you highlight this very well in the Latin American case. So similarities, but also differences here. But let's see now how these four federations come together in the Global Students Forum. So Sebastian, can you give us introduction on the Global Student Forum, which these federations and others have co-funded, and tell us about this new organization, please.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Manya, for making this event a reality and having us here for the Manya. We really appreciate it. The Global Student Forum was established very recently in 2020 after many years of groundwork conducted by colleagues from the regional student federations. Many of them are here now in the room. And our organization was founded exactly by the organizations that they are leading. So ASU, CSA, ESU, OBESU, and OCLAI, while being directly and indirectly supported by the 100 million campaign, and even more so by the Open Society Foundations and Education International. Our full members are the regional student federations and their national union of students, as well as national unions from countries that are not covered by the regional planner platforms, such as Canada, and since last week, which we are very happy about, NUS Australia has submitted their membership application. So at this point in the development of the GSF, we represent 197 student unions and organizations from 119 different countries in all parts of the world. Throughout 2019 and 2020, regional students leaders that were mandated to negotiate on behalf of the platforms have been working tirelessly to manufacture consensus for the inception of the GSF in countless meetings taking place all over the world, and then later with the pandemic, mostly online, to agree what shall be the main purpose of our cooperation. It also meant in parallel rallying our national unions in support of what we are doing, having NUS as national unions backing the considerable resources we have put into forging this global alliance. In the discussions, we quickly agreed that the forces shaping our lives nowadays can often not be faced within the boundaries of national or even regional thinking. And despite all of the differences that we might have as organizations, students worldwide are confronted with similar issues. We organize around the lack of quality education, against rising tuition fees and student debt, commodification of our education systems, as Bianca already said. Not to forget the environmental catastrophe, the contemporary spring of authoritarianism, the systematic erosion of democracy and rule of law, and the immoral distribution of global wealth and the suffering that comes with it. We came together for this project in solidarity to create a network for mutual empowerment and to amplify the voices of our constituency that in many times is not being heard well at the moment. What distinguishes the GSF from other international student NGOs is the bottom-up democracy enacted within the multi-level governance framework of our membership and the genuine belief in legitimate democratic representation and accountability of elected representatives. After a year now of establishing our structures, procedures, and organizational culture, we are now focusing on broadening participation, making sure that we do not become a disconnected entity that solely is concerned with high-level advocacy. We established 8 working groups open to more than 100 national representatives, organized trainings, weekly events, and best practice exchanges, and we are building a network of allies in civil society, academia, and international politics. Like for many other student organizations, historically, the challenge of financial survival is real, and the growing political support and positive reception of our emergence and activity is elevating, but without sustainable funding that doesn't come with political or commercial strings attached, it won't be enough to secure the long-term existence of the structure. To end on a positive note, though, with more and more people believing in this project, with our national and regional student unions supporting the cause, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the progressive voice of students will be heard louder and louder in even more spaces, speaking truth to power and bringing about the change that we see and so desperately need in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian, for this inspiring talk, and congratulations again to all of you for the achievement of establishing the Global Student Forum. I have, as a scholar, observed the attempts in the past which have not materialized, and I know how difficult it is to put such a platform together. So this is truly an achievement. Thank you for this introductory round of presentations. There are lots of questions for you, and I will try to be selective, and I'll ask you for a kind of a shorter responses. There were two questions by Noor and by Noah that have dealt with the question of institutional capacity and the limits and the obstacles in the institutional capacity. Noor specifically is asking Maisha to expand, but Noah is also wondering about how do you maintain motivation among the student leaders to stay committed when often they're volunteering, this is unpaid work, and when they're dealing with all sorts of other issues. And there was a third question as well in the Q&A, and I'm just adding it on so that you will be able to take them all, by Nor Marina, asking about how has the pandemic of COVID-19 affected the management of student unions in your respective student unions. And this is, let's start with this round, and then I have one more, hopefully that we can squeeze it in. But thank you for the attendees for posing the questions. We'll try to get as many in as possible. Let's start with that, institutional capacity and the COVID. Who would like to go first?
I can take that quickly since she asked me directly. So thank you, Noor, for the question. I think in terms of capacity building, there are multiple ways we can look at this. As part of the CSA, our job is to empower young people, empower the student leaders to participate in the development process according to their laws and regulations of member countries. Because you will realize, as more and more of us will speak over this panel, that the rules and regulations of different countries are very, very different. So as the CSA, we have developed this student governance toolkit to try and understand how this will fall in place within the remit of your laws. So a lot of student unions, they complain, or even governments, they share that student leaders may not necessarily be equipped to sit at the decision-making table. So we don't like to hear that. We want to make sure that, when we ask for a seat at the decision-making table, we have the capacity to come with researched documents, to have well-researched documents, we have data, to ensure that we are governed by constitutions, we're democratically elected. So all of these processes, they require that setup and that kind of push and training and leadership development. And that's what we're looking for in terms of capacity building. And therefore we created the toolkit, and the CSA was also involved in the Caribbean, doing capacity building training within the Caribbean countries, talking to student leaders, strengthening their own student union structures and student governance. So try to keep that short. In terms of COVID-19, I think it's not just one country or one union. I think it was felt across the board, really. I will speak later on the amazing things that came out of COVID as well, despite the challenges on how student impact was felt. But definitely, I would say that it has been taken, it's been a big obstacle for many student unions, whether, development of new national student organizations, whether that, engagement with ministers that were promised. Right now, because of the pandemic, a lot of these ministers are now really very busy. They're not able to engage with the student leaders. So a lot of things have taken a slower pace, but I'll speak later on the amazing impact that still came out of COVID.
Thank you. That Masha, maybe Martina, Peter, Bianca, would anybody of you like to add about how to keep the student reps motivated? Martina, you were nodding. Shall I?
Yes, it's always been something that we've been continuously discussing over the past year. We've seen that it was going to be a massive challenge, the fact that we were not able to meet, we were not able to share our experiences in person. Over Zoom, you don't get even half the same experience as an international event like a board meeting in person. So we've been really trying to identify, even within our own team, how we can motivate our volunteers, because ultimately they are also working in different countries and they have not met. So the idea was also to try and create more opportunities of working together on topics that you would not usually cover together. And this is like this method of trying to change our narrative, especially because we're all feeling like there's a lost hope in changing things. Many students out there are really suffering a lot of mental health issues. And many a times it boils down to the fact that you don't feel like your influence matters. So we're just trying to change, okay, the method or the approach or the content in which we're advocating for, and trying to work as much as possible together and take of a more holistic, okay, let's unite, let's answer some new questions using, okay, the policies that have showed success in the past.
Okay. Maybe Peter, a question for you. You have mentioned before, in many of the countries, student unions work against the authoritarian regimes. They are at the personal risk of being persecuted and otherwise. What kind of a support can your organization offer? How do you keep them motivated? Anything about this topic that you can share with us?
Yes, I can do that. And I do think that basically what we're saying is that our students remain persecuted, especially in authoritarian, spaces. And you'd find that, they're either brutalized, they are arrested without a warrant and all that. And I think that the GSF has really helped in that regard, because mostly what we have to do is to build international solidarity. And you would find that the majority of the times when that happens, we get almost every other person speaking on the matter, getting their countries to also bring the pressure to bear on the other people, the decision makers who make decisions like that. And so I think that that is where, for us as ASU, we seem to have benefited enormously for this global entity that we have built. And that's the way that we find that we're able to kind of get them either out of the cells or get any result for that matter. Then again, that's where I can tie in with COVID, because previously when this happens, we go on the streets, but now we can't get the permission to go on the streets. And so it's made it very difficult, because you can sit online and make all the noise as you can, but it doesn't have the same effect as when we go on the streets. And so given that we're constrained to have that unfettered access to the streets to demand things, were constrained. And in a part of Africa, it's a lot more difficult because we're not digital in that sense. And so emails, mobile, it doesn't work like that. You need to meet the people face to face, and with the advent of the pandemic, that's very difficult to do.
Bianca, I have another question from you here, from Nathan, from the World University News. And Nathan, it's interesting to hear more about the US or the English language hegemony that you have mentioned. How is that perceived, or how is that experienced, or in which way would you say that there is kind of a US hegemony felt in the Latin America when it comes to the student unions or higher education in general? Anything about that?
Okay, that's perfect. It's a big issue for us. Here in Brazil, we already have a problem with language because we are the only ones who speak Portuguese among a lot of brother countries, brother nations that speak Spanish. So communication in general is very hard between students, between society, and also um, it's a big challenge for our integration as a region. Of course, that in Brazil, we try to learn Spanish and we try to speak Spanish to be in this space, but we already have this obstacle with the language. And with English, it's even worse because it's very different from us. Between Portuguese and Spanish, you can find some similarities, but English is a true foreign language for us. So what happens here is that most of the population can speak English, can speak Spanish, and for English mainly, that's a challenge for the life of a lot of students because at the universities, for example, to enter a master's, to enter in a master's course, you have to prove that you are fluent in English. For a lot of jobs, you have to be fluent in English. So it's a big challenge in education because in public education, we don't learn how to speak English, but that will be required from us on the rest of our lives. The universities treats as normal, for example, indicating only English biography for the courses. I'm on the law school, for example, and I have to read a lot of stuff in English, some things even in French, in Italian, and we don't learn none of this on the university. So for us, it's a big challenge. And of course, for students, is the worst because if we want to study, we have to learn how to speak English, how to read in English. And with these big international universities that are growing here, it is becoming even worse.
Okay.
Private universities.
Yes, thank you, Bianca, for this. Maybe just one quick last question for Sebastian before we move to the next round. And I'm acknowledging that we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to bring some of them in the next round. But Sebastian, there was a question specifically whether GSF is experiencing some of the anti-Semitic adversity associated with George Soros, given that Open Society Foundation is sponsoring or has given some initial funding to the GSF. Is this an issue at all?
It's a very, very interesting question. So far, we have not run into any problems, any attacks that would target our organization. In general, we have adopted, as some of the regional platforms, the IRA definition, working definition on anti-Semitism. So we condemn anti-Semitism firmly and wherever it appears. But we also reserve our rights to criticize certain policies of the State of Israel. So so far, no problems, but it's something to keep in mind looking into the future.
Okay. Thank you all. Herewith, I'm going to kind of close this first round and let's move to the next round. And this is when I'm going to try to bring more questions because there are fantastic questions through the chat and the Q&A. I would like to hear more from the panelists here about really this kind of mechanisms of influence mentioned earlier. You know, whom do you influence and how do you go about presenting, defending student interest? Maybe let's start this time with Sebastian and just look at the Global Student Forum because it's a new entity. What are the aspirations? Who are the authorities that you might be projecting student interest to? And then we'll hear from the regional federations.
Thank you. We have built the GSF with a clear mandate to represent the interest of students in international decision-making bodies concerned primarily with education policy making, to have a legitimate democratic global voice that is recognized by partners in the INGO sector, international institutions, and more generally by relevant political actors out there. As clear as the mission statement is in terms of encouraging our advocacy towards international partners, it is also very clear when it comes to limiting the remit of our lobby work to global arenas and global agendas. So we do not interfere in any way with the autonomy of our regional platforms to lead discussions with regional, supranational, or intergovernmental organizations and political entities. So our focus is very much on worldwide players such as the United Nations and its framework with a specific focus on ECOSOC, the education and academia stakeholder group and its role in the high-level political forum, which we have 2 side events planned for this year, as well as UNESCO, but also the G7, G20, the OECD, the Interparliamentarian Union, which we have a good cooperation with, the ILO, making our move towards the World Bank at the moment and multilateral funds in global education. So we do this not only because we deeply believe that students as a transnational social class in society deserve a seat in the decision-making bodies that determine their educational realities, but also because we put sincere efforts into providing a genuine policy-led perspective on the needs and aspirations of young people on diverse issues by holding consultations, caucuses, and side events at international summits, informing and even more so steering our advocacy work. But we're also forging coalitions with like-minded organizations to increase our impact, having appointed student representatives within the executive boards of the Global Campaign for Education, namely Martina, the Magna Carta Observatory Governing Council, namely Peter, as well as the UNESCO GEM Report Advisory Council with Maisha and some other appointed members in the Global Partnership for Education. So we entered the global stage with the aim to put an end to tokenism and the cherry picking we are seeing in international decision-making arenas around the world. And so far, we have had mixed experiences approaching new organizations and players with our ask to basically collaborate. Some offered us channels for meaningful participation, and others are hesitant to have an independent voice of students interfering with their institutional status quo, with a general tendency as an argument to use to water down the legitimacy of higher education students as core stakeholders in education by blending us into the wider category of youth. So this is very much a work in progress and an ongoing campaign for us to build legitimacy and become recognized by the institutional and political arenas out there. And I hope that this unfinished answer still answers your question to a certain extent.
This is an excellent answer, and I know that people in this room have a lot of experiences doing very similar of convincing and putting your foot into the decision-making arenas on the national level as well and your regional platforms. Plus, having a strong, solid student voice will hopefully contribute to better policies, right? Better policies that will have impact on students globally. Thank you for this introduction. Let's hear from the regionals, maybe starting with Bianca, and see who does OCLAE directly speak to or try to influence? Who are the authorities that you're trying to present student voice to? Or are your ways also more conflictual rather than kind of direct advocacy and lobbying? That would be interesting to know.
Okay, thank you. Well, very often, considering that we are opposition to the governments in most of the countries, we can only be heard through pressure on the streets. We have an institutional influence, mainly because we are members of ESALC, which is UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also of ELASIS, which is the Latin America and Caribbean Space of Higher Education, and it's a regional initiative that brings together representative bodies of teachers, rectors, officials, and students, and with great influence in institutional policy formulation spaces. A notable example of the difficult of institutional action with governments to which we are opposed occurred in Brazil, with the coup that took place in the post-President Dilma in 2016. The entire social movement, including the National Union of Students, was removed from the national councils. So for the first time since the democracy took place back in Brazil in '85, we lost our seat on the constitutive body for opposing to the violation of Brazilian democracy that the coup represented. We also have a big fight regarding the election of rectors at the universities. The students have the right to vote in most of the country, but what happens in Brazil, with the exception of the rest of the continent, is that based on the vote carried out among the university community, with the votes of students, teachers, and workers on the same proportion, a triple list is formed, and the president of the republic is responsible for appointing the winner. And since the system was implemented, presidents have always maintained the democratic custom of nominating the most voted candidate to take seat. And this have changed with Bolsonaro government. He has systematically nominated the least voted candidates who are aligned with his ideology. So far, more than 20 illegitimate rectors have been appointed after finishing in third in the elections, which has led to a great struggle for the university autonomy, always inspired by the struggle of the students from Cordoba and guided by the intention that the university fulfills the better ways its role in society.
Anka, thank you so much for presenting the situation. Um, it's unconcerning developments that you are presenting as well. Let's hear from Martina and from the Europeans. How are the mechanisms of influence taking place there?
Yes, so over the years, our mechanism of influence has reduced from being as confrontational and rather become more institutional, becoming more in terms of cooperation through a number of stakeholder groups that also manage to advocate its sort of permanent seat on, thanks to many great alumni such as you, Manya. One of the most prominent committees is, of course, the Bologna follow-up group of the Bologna process, which we became consultative members through a very interesting story in 2001. So it's been quite a number of years since then where we've been basically running our advocacy based on the answers our membership gives us towards a massive survey that we conduct just before the ministerial conference at the end of each cycle of the Bologna process. So we listen towards our unions to tell us what is the situation in reality for the implementation of the commitments that our ministers are making within this process. Of course, there's also the European Union's institutions to which we strongly advocate for, particularly now in the rollout of the European Universities Initiative that is basically a cooperation between universities around Europe, and our push there is to see that there's the democratization of student participation in the student councils, as it was not so explicitly mentioned. But we're working together with our unions there, as well as, of course, there's the Council of Europe, that we participate in a number of projects and activities and subgroups, particularly on democratic citizenship education, human rights education. They really help us in building our capacity within the organization. So we realize how participating in these groups, cooperating with stakeholders, helps us to gain our capacity, as we have always that turnover that sometimes we lose the institutional memory of the organization, and this helps us to reestablish that. We've realized that because of the pandemic, we need to work more as much as possible, where is possible, as together with other stakeholders. So we're really trying to enhance our cooperation with partner organizations like the Trade Union for Teachers in Europe, the European University Association, the Lifelong Learning Platform, who also are more pushing towards the students' agenda as being sort of central. Now that then needs to translate, okay, to the national and institutional levels. That's another story for us. So as much as we focus sort of our lobby towards these institutions, then we need to focus on how we're supporting our unions for their voice to be recognized and empowered towards their national governments, that they face the same issues of turnover as we do, sometimes a bit more. So currently we've also been focusing on this rollout of the Next Generation EU. That's a single biggest investment on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and through that we're learning how to work together, how to establish that common goal to connect the unions. That is sometimes difficult because of our diversity, but like this, we're managing to connect ourselves together and stand in solidarity for the issues with which we should be standing for.
Thank you, Martina. Different continent, different circumstances, different mode of student politics, right? If we compare the Latin American context that Bianca just presented and the European one that Martina, but it took time, right? And Martina was pointing to this, that the mode of influence has changed, and the protest is also an option on different levels when other mechanisms fail. Let's hear from Maisha and then Peter about your modes of influence, whom you influence and how.
Thank you, Manya. As I mentioned earlier, our modus operandi is basically advocacy. So CSA is basically an advocacy body. So as our mandate of the CSA, we advocate for student voices to education stakeholders. We consult with student unions across the Commonwealth, and we present their recommendations to education ministers at the conference of Commonwealth education ministers for them to incorporate in their commitments and ministerial declarations. The CSA, we've been doing a lot of work with international institutions that have been championing the global agenda of student development and advancements. Some of them, some of the global NGOs that we've worked with along with my other partners here, 100 Million Campaign, Fighting for the Justice for Every Child. We've worked with Awareness 360 on breaking gender-based violence. We, of course, work very, very closely in solidarity with regional student organizations, ASU, ESU, OVESU, and we've played an important role also in helping to shape the currently developing Caribbean Students Union, which represent 20 countries across the Caribbean, and they're working to partner with CARICOM as the official student movement in the Caribbean. And as I mentioned in the previous round, we work with national student organizations, and where they don't exist, with student organizations that are led and democratically elected. Now, there are a vast range of models of student representation across the Commonwealth. I want to zone in a little bit on the Commonwealth Asian countries. Here in the Commonwealth Asian countries, there are no national student organizations, only student unions, but they also have varying degrees of involvement in participating in national higher education policy or even having a seat at the relevant councils. So I'll highlight a few examples and you'll see how starkly different they are from one another. In Malaysia, for example, the National Union of Malaysian Muslim Students, that's one of the oldest student organizations. It's an independent NGO. It receives their annual grants from the Ministry of Youth. They're not an official NSO for the country due to political reasons, but they have a permanent membership on the National Youth Consultative Council, and they're also registered under their Youth Development Act. So this council, when I spoke to the president, he mentioned that it is in fact the highest body for youth and students to decide on youth policies, on national and higher education policies, which are brought to them first and then brought into Parliament for discussion. So that's actually a lot of voice on a high level when we observe this. And this is a similar model also used by the Maldives National Student Union, which is registered with the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Community as an NGO. And they are consulted for comments and recommendations on higher education policies. Now, if we contrast that to Singapore, again, no NSOs due to low political will and differing levels of autonomy of the student unions within their individual higher education institutes. But they have really good and close personal contacts with the Ministry of Education. So that kind of effective and open communication is there, so it doesn't give them that incentive to come together and form an NSO. They function under the university administration, and they act as a bridge between students and administration. They sit on university boards as well in terms of decision making. If we look at Pakistan, they have a ban on national or university students since 1984. So there are officially no elected student unions in the universities. There are several independent student organizations, many formed from political parties, and they have to lobby independently, though not officially recognized. The National Student Federation, for example, they are independent and they have been campaigning and lobbying, and between 2017 to 2018, they successfully helped to develop a new university in Pakistan, despite not having that direct recognized voice. And finally, I'll quickly touch on India, which has been very, very interesting for me to study, is that they have a very unique model of student representation. They have multiple national student unions, but they're not directly, based on my conversations with different members from these bodies, they're not directly representing student interest in higher education. Because each of these student unions, they're actually the youth wing of specific political parties. So their agenda is usually closely linked to the political ideology. I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, but this is like a model that they follow, and they don't necessarily have that kind of say unless their parent party forms the government. So in such an environment, it becomes quite challenging to have all students represented in one unified manner. So I hope that gave you a little bit of a glimpse on just in one region, how there's so many different modes of operation on student representation.
Maisha, thank you so much for these different models and different examples, which can be seen also in other regions as well. But you have nicely presented it within the CSA. Peter, let's hear the African example, and again, having in mind the conflictual politics and cooperative politics. How does it work, and what are the main points of influence for ASU itself, first of all?
Yeah, thank you very much, Manya. I do think that with the African context, what would largely happen is that there is that sense of patriarchal system that there is. And so there's that respect for the elderly, there's that patriarchal where, like, I mean, the gender dimensions don't play in the same way. And all of these sort of have an influence in terms of how we organize our student bodies, to what extent they are invited to the decision-making table. And so if you look at it in that sense, for us as ASU at the continent-wide level, we do work with the African Union, the education division. And so we influence policy at that level to the extent that we're engaged. And so, for example, the African continental qualifications framework is one that ASU is a member of the governing board that is looking at its drafting, its designing, etc. And we've benefited enormously from either parts of the GSM because it's something that has been done in Europe through the Bologna process. And so seeing as they have done it, and because of the collaborations, we get to learn a lot from them, and we get to sort of propose ways that we can be part of a process like that. And we work also closely with UNESCO. We do have a consultative status with UNESCO. In fact, in the recent Global Education Coalition that was launched in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are a member of the coalition, and a lot of the work that we've done on the gender flagship with children and all of that, we've done that through the coalition. We also work closely with African government. We do so through the ministries of education. And so from depending on government to government and how receptive they are, we do work closely with the ministries of education in the sense that we do dialogue with them a lot. But it's on the continuum. So depending on the extent to which they are more open, more democratic, but as they drift towards more authoritarian, we sort of reduce our impact. And so when it comes to the university and governing levels, you would find that there's more tokenism at that level. And so let me share an example. I mean, it is when there's audit. So when there's about to be an audit, the students are invited just as a checklist, just to check that, I mean, they are consulted. But in a real sense of the word, in terms of when decisions are being made about what is taught, who teaches that, I mean, who does all of those things, this is something that the students are consulted for. And let me share a very quick example. So I had the opportunity to sit on a table where vice chancellors, and then we're introducing ourselves. I introduced myself as a student, and then one vice chancellor from Tanzania is asking, what is a student doing here? He can't understand why vice chancellors are meeting and the student is invited to speak. And so for him, when I did suggest that students should be involved at various levels, for his mind, he can't see what the student has to offer in terms of that table. So in our part where it's more patriarchal, where there are tendencies for elderly children sort of relationship, it's the sort of, it's transposed on the system of governance and the extent to which we're involved. And I do think that in our case, because there are so many differences across the continent, it's a very huge continent. It's so different in terms of Francophone, Arabic, English, Portuguese, with different systems, different governance modules, and all of that. It's particularly difficult. And so you find that, for example, a country like Benin, you find 4 students and unions, and the government sponsors some of the student bodies, and the extent to which they are in power, they can choose the student body that they can deal with as the legitimate one. So it's not so much of who has been elected by the student body or even has the mandate of the student body, but it's so much of who the government chooses to recognize as being legitimate. But those happen in the spaces where you realize that it's less democratic, it's less where there are open spaces to have conversations. So the dynamic is very different as you drift towards democracy and as you drift towards autocracy or authoritarianism. So these are the context that you'll find, but it's not all doom and gloom. You'd find in a country like Ghana, for example, students are incorporated at the highest level. So the example I can give is the Ghana Education Trust Fund. This is the fund that disburses education at a very highest level. There's a student representative on the governing board that disburses the funds. And again, there's the Student Loan Trust Fund. That too, it is required by statute that the student should be on the governing board. So you realize that if there is regulation and policy, it makes it easy for students to be involved. If you take out regulation and policy, it becomes discretionary for people to decide whether they want to involve us or not. So the more regulation, the more policy we can get, the more it will be very okay for us to be involved in sessions like this.
Peter, thank you so much. Thank you so much for reminding us of the importance of the political context, the political regime and its influence onto how universities are structured, but also on the possibilities for student union representatives to actually represent student interest, and also on the importance of the formalizing and institutionalizing the mechanisms of student representation that students, as they get elected into the position, can rely on rather than negotiate from year to year their ways to be part of the discussion in the universities or on the national level. So this was very, very, very interesting. Again, a broad example. I hope that through your project, there is going to be a better picture and understanding of this variety of the models that we see globally. In interest of time, I'm going to skip the Q&A right now, but I'm noting the questions, and many of our panelists are already answering individually the questions that have been fielded to them, and would like to finish with a last round before we go in the final Q&A. And the last round is really just looking into what are some of the issues that are right now on your agenda of your unions that you are working on that have to do with the student impact on higher education. Very broad question. Any highlights, anything, any specific challenge that is right now something that you are working on? And in this round, I would like to start with Maisha, please, so that we have a little bit of a mixture of the speakers. Maisha, what's happening? What is preoccupying CSA and you in your work at the moment that you would like to highlight for this seminar?
Thank you, Manya. I want to talk about one of the challenges that I actually mentioned in the first question about tokenism. And that's something that was faced by student unions across the Commonwealth or not being taken seriously by the government. This research was published in 2016. And since then, over this past 5 years, and also during my the CSA tenure over the past 3 years, I want to say that we're hopeful because we've seen significant improvement in authentic inclusion of student voices, both through consultation and high-level representation. So let's just take another example, like taking the Jamaica Union of Tertiary Students, which is the NSO in Jamaica. For example, they've become a very, very prominent and recognized voice over the past few years, contributing to high-level decision-making and having a seat on education boards due to excellent advocacy and positioning, right? And in that kind of capacity building, that kind of leadership that they take on is really important. One of the highlights of the Commonwealth Students Association is the recent development of the Guyanese National Student Organization. So, they've now developed as a unified voice in Guyana, but unfortunately, of course, due to COVID, things have taken a little bit of a backseat, but we're committed to empowering them to build back up in terms of a strong governance. Back to the Jamaica Union of Tertiary Students, I did mention that I wanted to talk about some very prominent and positive examples that came out of COVID, despite the challenges. So during this COVID pandemic, as we know, all of this teaching has moved online, and the union then successfully lobbied for zero rating of all online learning platforms in Jamaica to close that gaping digital divide. And I don't think this is a Jamaican problem. This digital divide is, it's exposed in many countries around the world. They've also provided premium Zoom accounts for young people and youth leaders and student leaders to come together and conduct forums and workshops so they don't be missing out in an entire year of, no activism, for instance. And over this year, they've also successfully lobbied for refunds of fees paid by students on their work and travel program that was canceled due to COVID. And that shows us the impact of, what unified student voices can make. So I want to end my section highlighting that while NSOs are a great model that we're aiming for as members of our CSA, and we're also, if you don't have an NSO, we're very committed to trying to strengthen your student union structure so that you're empowered to make your own decisions and have a seat at the decision-making table. There are many other models, that can be still effective in amplifying student voice, ensuring that they're represented at the high-level decision-making tables, or even participating in policy reviews. So when I mentioned the Malaysian and Maldivian, student union, they appear to be very effectively incorporating their student voice and participation without having an NSO. And while the Singapore model is more consultative in terms of the student participation, the engagement, I think I've discussed this with you before, is very much dependent on the initiative and proactiveness of the minister, which may not be an effective model for many, many countries, to be very fair. And in fact, over the past year, Singapore has seen a reshuffling of the Ministry of Education with 3 different education ministers in a tenure of one student union leadership. So re-establishing that relationship would need to now begin again. So I think we're always committed to, our mandate is to commit to strengthening their unions and ensuring that their voices are strong enough to represent themselves within their unions. And we do still advocate very strongly for national student organizations, because as we can see with Jamaica, it provides that stable, unified platform to represent all student voices and provides the strength and unity required for a strong and informed voice. And this is why the CSA has also been, very involved and active in helping to set up the Global Student Forum, as it is, it unifies various regional and multi-regional platforms to promote one unified global and just voice. And I think I'd want to end there.
Thank you so much, Maisha. And the important message of cooperation between the unions and sharing of good practices and empowering each other, and hopefully now sharing also knowledge generated by the student unions from globally that will help to build the capacity as well. So thank you for that. Let's hear from Martina. Any highlight that you would like to share with you on what is preoccupying now you and ESO?
If I could focus on one topic, although there are many, one topic that I haven't really spoken about in my previous interventions, it's academic freedom and human rights. That has become quite a rising problem for us, not as much as, of course, as Peter was mentioning, of course, in Africa. But we are seeing rising trends of governments that are imposing influence, political influence on the autonomy of universities. And our unions are speaking up, and they're getting threatened either organizationally, so either through budget cuts, or personally. And of course, the most prominent situation is what we see has been going on in Belarus. That has been incredibly frustrating, because it's something that has been existing and concurrently happening over years. There is the courage to speak up from the unions. There is the courage for them to come together and stand together for these fundamental values. But sometimes we feel like we're fighting a losing battle. We're not seeing the change which we're advocating for. We do not have the jurisdiction to change anything in the country from the outside. So while our international solidarity will remain consistent, we want to start understanding what are the new mechanisms by which we can lead to the change that we would like to see, because our unions are speaking up about this, and we didn't have it so much written explicitly in our policy. Even in the BFUG, it did not have a specific group working on it. It was just sort of this guaranteed thing, but it of course is not. So there's this concomitant, there's this twofold approach in the fact that the BFUG, the Bologna process, many countries in Europe are speaking out. They are working within their governments to offer scholarship programs for students who are being exiled, for example, from Belarus, but this is also in Norway for other countries, like the Students at Risk program, which we're also trying to multiply in other countries. But we're also trying to understand what is our capacity as an international organization, what is the capacity of our unions to advocate for better and stronger actions that can help lead to this change. So we're now applying for a project funding that we would coordinate entirely as ESU as well, and start actually surveying the indicators of academic freedom, because we don't really talk about academic freedom when we're at our university. What does that mean? Does it just only mean that I can post what I want on my social media, or does that also mean that I should be able to study and write whatever research that I determine is the research that I want to? So by understanding what are the indicators students understand by academic freedom, then we can possibly have more students uniting for this cause. And I'm really excited for this project.
Thank you for that, Martina, and thank you for flagging it. Again, their resonance to your topic in other regions and to the history, and history is repeating itself, and you need to find new ways of addressing it. Thank you for that. Peter, let's hear from you and Asu. What would you like to highlight? What are some of the issues you're working on now?
Yeah, so for us, mainly we have to deal with a number of issues that's not vastly different. And I think that, again, I might have to mention that when we do map out the issues we deal with, there's a lot of commonality in terms of student debt, in terms of student accommodation, in terms of the response to if we want to have a seat at the table. And that's something that we've had to fight over and over again, because mainly we want to be part of the decision when it is made, and not when we're told at what point we can come on board. And so the key thing to get on the table is a fight that we've had to do that over and over again. And again, it would link up to the points that I made earlier, that we live in a continent that is heavily patriarchal. And so that relationship between the elderly and the younger people is one that is expressed not only in cultural settings in that sense. And so it is imported into when they make policy and they want to suggest that we do not have anything to bring to the table in terms of contributions. And much as it might look trivial in a sense, it's very touchy in terms of the fact that we want to have a say in terms of what we are taught. We want to have a say in terms of who teaches it. We want to have a say into what we are taught, because at the end of the day, we want that we should be fit for purpose. There's an industry out there that we want to be employable. We want to have skill sets, competences that are employable on the market. And so the extent to which we want to do that, if it's student-centered versus teacher-centered, these are discussions that we've had to be going back and forth. But if you look at what our counterparts in Europe, they, because of how advanced they are, maybe they can get a couple of student-centered way of doing something much easier than we can get it on our side. Then again, maybe the last thing that I can touch on briefly is the fact that majority of the times when we have been engaged at the highest level has been when it has been a joint project between the European Commission and the African Union. And the European counterparts have always had to insist that there has to be a student involvement. And so in that sense, it's tied to the grant. And so that's why I do mention that a lot of the times when there is a statute, a policy that sort of ties their hands, they are more obligated in a sense to make sure that students are involved. So majority of the issues has to do with the student debt, student accommodation, and rising fees, massification of education, implying that we don't have the spaces and we have to keep fighting about fees increment, the fees must fall, etc. So these are the key issues that we have to deal with on our side of the continent.
And overall whole quality of education, right? As you have said, student-centered quality higher education for all. Thank you for that, Peter. Let's hear from Bianca. What is Oclaya cooking these days? What are some main issues that are on your agenda?
Okay, perfect. First of all, we are adapting ourselves to these pandemic times and all the new necessities that it has created. What we are doing right now is trying to keep some kind of normality and making our events all hosted in Zoom. But we are also having some presential activities due to our 55th anniversary. And the main discussion on the continent right now is the situation of the students and of the populations on the pandemic. For the deep social inequality, a lot of students can access remote education because don't have computer, don't have access to internet, or because they are now in the informal market of labor, working without any right and receiving low salaries just to help their families. Due to this situation, in defense of the vaccination of the population and against the genocidal policy of Jair Bolsonaro government in Brazil, which led us to become the world record holder in number of deaths, we are wishing 500,000 citizens who lost their lives this week. And so Brazilian students took over the streets of the entire country with symbolical acts on 30th of March at the Yoke Journey Day. It was a moment of rebellion and struggle by Brazilian students against the misgovernment and the policy of death and in defense of the lives of the population, which is seriously suffering from the health crisis and its economic and social consequences. I think that in the whole world, we are having some trouble to vaccinate most of the population, but in Brazil, this problem deepens itself because our president defends the obscurantism. He's not in favor of the vaccine. He didn't even vaccinate himself. He didn't want it to buy vaccines to the population. So it's a difficult situation for us. And for this reason, the last year has been marked by serious neglect that has deepened our social inequalities. The number of unemployment already exceeds 14 million, and the informal work without a guarantee of any labor right has become a reality for the majority of the population, who had to continue exposing themselves to the risk of contracting the coronavirus to maintain their families. So an intense process of struggle by students in the social movement ensured that during the last year, families received an emergency financial aid, which unfortunately had its availability interrupted since December, and its value is now drastically reduced for the coming months. It was also the struggle of students that ensured the availability of teaching material for high school students and the supply of internet access chips so that they could follow their classes and activities of remote learning. We fight for no student to be left behind or give up their education due to the obstacles imposed by this difficult time. But Brazil is a large country, and unfortunately, there is still a lot of students who can access education because they don't have material conditions. So now we are going to take the streets again on June 19, demanding for more policy and budget for education, for an emergency aid that enables the livelihood of family, for a broad vaccination policy, which proves to be the main way to overcome this crisis that we are facing, and for the Fora Bolsonaro, Out Bolsonaro, which is an urgent agenda for us Brazilian students to resume the development of Brazil as a democratic country and as a huge nation. So I would say that the main fight in the continent right now is the fight for vaccine and in defense of education and in defense of food for all the families.
Bianca, we hear you. We hear existential questions and the struggle that students are part of inevitably. The public health crisis, the economic crisis, the social inequalities that are reflected as well in life of students and their ability to receive quality education. All of this you have portrayed very well, and all of those are issues that echo in other regions as well. I will end with Sebastian and with a kind of a final question, and then we will have some time to answer some of the questions which have now accumulated to the largest end. And if you wish to field the question, this will our last moments, because in a few minutes after we hear Sebastian, I'll try to pull few for the final rounds for the answers. Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manya. I think it's really hard to only highlight one specific initiative in relation to this broad topic of students' impact, but I will try to focus on the issue of capacity building that we touched upon earlier in the discussions and related to one of our upcoming programs. I personally believe that students' impact on higher education governance and policy is a complex game of collaboration and conflict, and of developing skills and cultivating knowledge within the leadership of our unions to enable student representatives to speak on more or less equal grounds with academic and non-academic political decision makers. Facilitating these capacity building efforts in the spirit of international cooperation is one of the core missions of the GSF, and we are rolling out our first academy in leadership and advocacy this year. This academy is a one-year educational program for 60 student leaders from the regional and national membership of our organization, and it's composed of online masterclasses aimed at supporting student representatives in developing their competences for quality advocacy, for successful campaigning, as well as mobilization and leadership of membership-based organizations more broadly. The premier edition in 2021 and 2022 features 17 webinars over the course of 2 semesters, according to the academic semester, with each session being facilitated by a hand-picked guest lecturer with invited speakers from academia, from the NGO sector, from renowned higher education institutions, but also from value-aligned political actors and professional skills trainers. Alongside building up this crucial knowledge, the program aims to encourage worldwide networking between our national leaders from the student movement with the intention to foster critical global and international thinking and cooperation through the personal connections and organizational collaborations that will hopefully result from putting so many student leaders in one room so many times, even though it's just a digital one for now. In parallel, we are also putting in place our knowledge hub that will enable our membership to share learning resources and experiences between each other. We believe that this is especially important since it lies in the nature of student unions, as colleagues were already saying before, that we have a fast pace generational turnover that in the worst case scenario equals a reset button in the organizational development of student unions. So that's what we want to focus on. If we want to be effective as international students movement, we need to ensure that our organizations and their representatives are equipped with the tools to create impact. And we are determined to support our membership in delivering these opportunities to their national and also their local communities.
Sebastian, thank you. It sounds an ambitious and important agenda, and I wish you all the best, and your partner as well. Our time is running out, but I'm going to just throw at you a number of questions that have been here in the chat and just let you maybe pick something that talks to you. One question that has been raised often is really the engagement of the political parties in the work of the student unions and whether this is an issue for you or not. I could see Maisha already answering something to the chat, but maybe if any of you would like to tackle that question, political party involvement in the work of the student unions. We also had a question from Noah from South Africa, and the question was, how do you engage with people who are against the social change you promote? And this is specifically probably targeting some of you who deal with authoritarian regimes and who are promoting social change through student activism, or who are supporting student activism towards the social change. And any examples that you would like to take on that. And the one question is still kind of open there. Oh, there is an interesting question as well, corruption in the student body, and the corruption or the malpractices or poor governance in the student unions, and how do you handle that? Thank you, Maverick Seda, for this question. And I think with this, I will probably, and maybe one question from Robert Sylvester: how can we cooperate together in ensuring that students' welfare in the respective regions are being given concerns in global community? So again, perhaps the role of the Global Student Forum in addressing the student welfare concerns in different regions. And the final one, I'm just kind of probably mostly highlighting, and I'll give you a minute each to do whatever final concluding remark. One question was also, what are your thoughts on the riots in response to the government's and universities' academic policy decision, or your attitudes towards student protests, also student violent protests? I think that might be kind of a hidden question inside here, in response to or student protests as a means of countering the government and university policies. So there's more here. Some of things have been answered already. Let me just see if something came in very quickly so that I at least just mention it. Lots of questions about how different people and organizations can join your respective organizations. So I'll leave that to you individually, and I hope that attendees will contact you individually. I flagged the questions, but I really am just leaving very brief final remarks from each of you, maybe starting with Martina, then Bianca, then Peter, then Maisha, and Seb. Final remark, closing remark, just pushing maybe 5 minutes over. Anything on any of these topics, or final plans to conclude this panel?
Yeah, so basically on the corruption in the student unionism, we have not encountered that issue yet, so maybe I'm not the best to speak on that, although many of our unions are speaking up now about academic integrity, and taking a platform as well to take action if they realize that there are either politicians, but it could also be people in student unions who have breached academic integrity. But however, on how to promote social change through student representatives, a very difficult question for me. I entered ESO as Human Rights and Solidarity Coordinator in 2019 and instantly got the case of Belarus in my hands, and I was completely lost as to how to target it. The usual way that we have been sort of voicing our concerns, apart from going to, for example, the Bologna process, and actively voicing out the situation that is in reality in Belarus, whereas they're calling it fake news, is to connect with European institutions like the EU, to connect with Amnesty International, who have also been working now with our unions in Belarus, Scholars at Risk and EUA, basically branching out to first of all learn how other organizations, well-established organizations, tend to deal with these issues. But as you can see from the last flight from Ryanair that was hijacked in Belarus, particularly to arrest a journalist and a student from Lithuania, then you sort of question again, what is the impact that we can have? So yes, we always support our students in whatever in whatever actions they tell us that they would like to take. We try to be as supportive as possible from our side, and as much as possible have the board also, our board members also involved and understanding and giving us also the go ahead on whatever actions that we would like to take. As I mentioned, we're focusing on the Students at Risk program, but in this new project, we would hopefully also start to question what are the mechanisms of change, what are the battles that we're trying, what are the weapons that the governments have against students, particularly in this digital world, that makes it perhaps a bit more difficult for student unions, although in massive amounts, going out on the streets to still not cause that social change. So we're trying to see what other mechanisms and approaches we can take.
Thank you, Martina, for this. Bianca, any response to any of the questions that you have heard, or just final concluding words, please?
Yes, of course. I think I would like to respond two main questions here. First of all, about the participation of the political parties, which is very strong in all the organizations that are members of OCLAI. We have some different opinions on that, depending on the country. In Brazil, for example, on the National Students Union, we have more than 10 political parties who are members of our directory. And for us, it is something very important and that only makes us stronger, because if there are students who are members of these political parties and we can make all of them to work for the National Students Union, for us that's great, and it means that we can transcend a little bit the political conflicts and work together for it. In other countries, perhaps we don't have the same plurality on the national unions that we have here. So it is very common, for example, that political party youths are fighting for the direction of the entity without being able to make a mandate to make the same directory together. For us here is something that makes us stronger, and I think that is positive because the political parties here have large youths and are the main way for students to organize themselves. So it's very important for us, and it makes us more representative. And also, the other one was about, oh my God, I remember, about working with people and with students who are against our fights. That happens a lot because the political rights and faces are increasing in Brazil and in other countries of the region. In general, these people and these students do not maintain a healthy dialogue with the student unions, and they work against us. So we have some unions of right students who do not want to run for the National Students Union. They don't want to participate because they are not big enough, or because they don't want to legitimate us as students representatives. But they are organizing in parallel organizations. In general, it doesn't make much difference for us because the national unions are very large and are very organized in the universities of our country. But if it's necessary, for example, it already happened to us to have to offer legal support for students who are being prosecuted or who are suffering some injustice of the authorities of the universities, and they are not political aligned to us or that were against our organization, but look at for us, and we will never let any student without support. So I think that we can make the way we act and the way we deal with this is actually being stronger and paying support for every student when it's needed, independent of his political position and everything.
Yes, they are your constituency, all of them, right? Regardless of their background or political orientation. Thank you, Bianca. Peter, let's hear from you, and then Maisha and Sebastian, and then we'll be wrapping up and letting everyone a little bit pushing the deadline, but I want to do this final round. Peter, please.
Thank you very much, Maya. And to close, let me first say thank you to you, and thank you to Seb, and thank you to everyone for making time to join. Let me just touch on two things that I see cutting across the charts that have come in, and mainly they dwell on the political interference. And you know that this is what accounts for the collapse of the IUS. I mean, mainly it was founded by the Soviet bloc on the one side and then the West on the other side. And clearly, I mean, that was going to lead to self-destruction at some point. And continuously, if we cannot find sustainable funding models for student unions, it will be the point that politically there will be interference, because I mean the political parties clearly have incentive and motive, and so they pay, and it's clear that he who calls the piper would obviously call the tune. And so if they sponsor the student bodies, clearly they would serve their interest, and you'd see that they splinter them, they cause them to fight among themselves, and then the student interest is left somewhere. And so I'm just saying this because I've just come out of a meeting in the morning where we're talking about funding, and then the hesitation is that the student bodies don't handle funds well. And so I posed, and then they sort of compared us with teacher unions. And then I asked them a simple question. When you take an institution like EI, the people, the staff there have job security. They are employed for God knows how long. I mean, we come in and leave year in, year out with skills, and we transfer skills, we deal with it. And we can't have chartered accountants to keep our accounts in the same way as EI can do that. You cannot make those comparisons. We have to account for things using students. We have to do all of these things. And so if you pitch the bar at the top, then clearly you're not going to put money in. But there's the advocacy that we have to do, and a lot more things that the institutions don't do. We risk, because if you look at, I mean, from post-colonial days, it's been the student organization always at the front lines. It's not any other organization, it's not the other civil, it's the students. We have always demanded accountability, and we're going to continue to do that. But we need the support to be able to do something like that. Otherwise, those who have the interest are going to take the organizations and then turn it. I mean, in countries like Egypt, I mean, clearly there isn't even that space to accommodate a student body. And together with SU, GSF, we're about to fight a lot about students that have been detained in Egypt. And there's no space to even allow a student body to even establish itself. And yet Egypt will receive all the funding from the global community. We bring all the issues to the fore, and it doesn't get, but the point is that the extent to which we can continue to mobilize ourselves would strengthen our position to be able to put our issues out there. And so it matters that we can't get the support that we need to be able to mobilize properly. And so I'm happy that Maya, we're bringing this conversation to this level such that we amplify the issues, we bring to the fore the issues that we're fighting, and I'm sure that in time we'll get the needed support. And lastly, I do think that there has to be some level of accountability at the higher education level. For example, I mean, CEOs are fired when they are not doing a good job. Vice chancellors keep their jobs even when it is clear that students are not employable, they are not getting the right skill sets and competences. I don't know the KPIs that we're going to have to use to hold people to be accountable in the same way as corporates, entities, and all of that are accountable. Maybe when we have these conversations, we'll begin to come up with benchmarks on what are the metrics that we also use to say that the education administrators are also doing well. Without that accountability, there's anything goes. So I think that those would be my closing remarks.
Thank you, Peter. Let's continue with Maisha, please.
Thank you so much, Manya. So firstly, before, it's the ending. So I really want to thank Manya for organizing us, finding all of us and putting all of us together. This would not have been possible without you. I'd like to answer two questions. I think one from Athira on the political parties. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on that. And I think from Maverick on corruption. So let's start with the corruption one first. I think, we as student leaders, we come together, we form student bodies to hold our leaders accountable. So, I don't want it to sound speechy or cliche that we ourselves have to uphold certain, certain code of conduct, and it's absolutely not okay if any of us engage in corruption. That being said, as much as moral values and all of that are great, we need to have proper structure in place to hold ourselves accountable as well. So I'll give you an example of what happens in the Commonwealth Students Association. We have a democracy and disciplinary committee that is led by a vice chairperson for democracy and participation. And there's an independent group of individuals from different student unions who sit on that board. So if there is corruption or anything that is against the constitution that is being conducted, they're able to hold us accountable to that. And the democracy committee has the power of removing someone from the executive committee, if including myself, if we are found to have any sort of breaches, which is why I think it's really important that we have like proper governing documents. So it's really important to have constitutions, check that legally. And that's why capacity building is also important, because it's easy to get a group of passionate students together, but it's quite challenging to develop a structure, as my other colleagues have been talking about, having a structure, having that recognition, and having that visibility and legitimacy that you're valid and you have some kind of governing document. So for structures for universities that don't have it, actually, if you did reach out to Sebastian as well, he put that email address. We will forward you the Commonwealth Students Association toolkit that the association put in a lot of hard work to create, whether it's funding, financial sustainability, leadership development, etc. I think that's quite a good document to have a look at if you're trying to build the strength of your student leadership. In terms of political parties, Athira, thank you for that question. That has been one of our challenges. I'll be very frank. It's been quite difficult for us to make that judgment call, because there is nothing in our constitution that says that we cannot work with student unions that are politically aligned, but in some cases we've seen, I don't really want to mention the name of organizations, but we've seen in some cases where certain organizations, student union organizations, while they're being politically aligned, they also have been reported in the media to be violent, to be extorting or torturing individuals and stuff. We cannot work with those organizations, even if they do choose to be our member, because we have to work with the Commonwealth values. So again, we have some guiding principles, democracy, human rights, peace and security, tolerance, respect, the list goes on. And if you don't align with certain Commonwealth values, we're not going to be able to engage with them. So in the situation of India that I explained, where you have multiple different student wings of the political parties, if we engage one of them, we'll need to engage all of them, so that we can be sure that we're having a fair representation and not just meddling, with internal politics, because we have to stay out of that, within, out of the internal politics of the country. They need to manage that. So all in all, I think in both, both questions, I think having regulatory governing documents, I think that's very important to help you guide through that process.
Thank you so much, Maisha. Sebastian, closing words from the GSF, please.
I don't really don't really intend to use much more of your time. The colleagues from the regional platforms have thoroughly answered to most of the questions. Maybe just on the question of social and political impact, I do think that the momentum and this unique window of opportunity that we had with regional platforms and their national members coming together with a positive intention to form this alliance was not naturally given, and is still not. And that's not only for international work, but rather for the self-definition of student unions in different parts of the world, whether a student union should be solely concerned with quality assurance, with educational advocacy, or whether we organize to hold our governments accountable to the broader factors that touch our life reality and to social injustice. And what we are doing with our engagement in international organizations and the high-level political forum, Education 2030, is trying to hold governments accountable through the SDGs, monitoring their progress. And I think if we all do this, and if we commit ourselves and our unions to be political entities that look over the side of the plate that the higher education institution represents, we are set to make a positive contribution to our overall development. And I hope that this strain of thinking will stay within the students' movement for a very long time to come still. Thank you very much for organizing this, Manya.
Sebastian, Martina, Maisha, Peter, Bianca, thank you so much to our panelists for your time, for your insights, for your inspiration, for sharing with us your expertise. Thank you so much to the attendees for staying with us, even though we have pushed it a little bit and I have taken the executive decision, which you can as a chair to do so. And for all of the excellent questions, please feel free to contact the panelists directly for further explanations and further questions. This was the Mahindra seminar on universities on student impact on higher education globally. This group is herewith has launched a cooperation in a global comparative project on this very topic. So more events and more publications to come, and we will keep you informed. But for today, thank you so much from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you to all for being with us, and herewith I'm closing this webinar. Thank you.